Survivors of plane crashes, boat sinks. What's your story? Our open boat sank. When I was 9, we were traveling from our cabin back to town with open boat. This was right before Easter. About a 45 minutes trip. The seas were rough and the boat had a built-in flaw that caused it to break in 2 pieces due to the pounding on the waves. I sat face towards the back, so I didn't see it break, just suddenly had water up to my waist. When I turned around, the nose was floating a couple of meters away from the boat. My mom's husband at the time just said, "Jump," and so we did, into the black 2-degree water of the North Sea, as far away from the boat as possible. This was by far the scariest moment. Her husband managed to launch 2 emergency rockets before the boat vanished below him. He was a very poor swimmer, and even though we tried to hold on to him, he got away from us due to large waves constantly covering us. After that, it was about 10 minutes of trying to swim to shore, which was about 400 meters away, before realizing we were never going to make it. After that, we basically dodged waves and made bad taste jokes. We saw people on the shore, cars stopped on the highway. The last thing I remember before blacking out is a boat approaching. Then I woke up in the hospital, basically trashing around from the cramps of my body trying to warm up. Apparently I had a temp of 27 degrees when they brought me in. My mom was awake the whole time. She lost control of her limbs right after I blacked out, and gripped a rope from my life vest with her teeth so I wouldn't float away. Even though this is a scary story, there are some awesome elements to it. An old fisherman in a house by the shore saw the whole thing. He was desperately trying to get a hold of rescue services, but no one was where they were supposed to be. His wife, having lost both her previous husband and also a son at sea, had some kind of a health issue while watching us swim around. So he had to take care of her and try to get us help. The most badass part of the story is how we got rescued. One of my mom's husband's friends got a call about what was happening. Got in his boat with his 8-month pregnant wife and went full speed to our location. The boat he had was not designed for high seas. It was a summer-type cabin cruiser, so he had to steer it towards the waves at all times. His wife then proceeded to pull 3 fully clothed people up to safety, including an unconscious me. If anyone has ever tried to pull someone out of the water, you know how difficult it is. We all survived. I was totally fine, aside from my balls swelling up to 3 times the normal size for a couple of days. Mom tore a bunch of stuff in her back. Husband swallowed about 4 liters of saltwater and was sick for a week. TLDR. Boat broke I-2, cold water, amazing rescue. Why did your balls swell up? The extreme cold likely caused a significant lack of blood flow, especially in the testicles. Lack of blood flow is why your balls swell up like cantaloupes if you get testicular torsion, which is when your spermatic cords twists and thus cuts off blood flow to the balls. Torsion is the worst pain a man can possibly experience as there's so many nerves in the area. Considering his were frozen, they likely numbed pretty good. Plus, there was likely still minimal blood flow, so it likely wasn't as severe as a torsion would be. Warning message to everyone. If you ever have constant significant pain in your balls that gets worse as time passes, swelling, discoloration, and you think they may be twisted, get to the ASAP. Testicular torsion is a medical emergency and can lead to the death of one or both testicles if not treated in over 6 hours. I'm relieved your mom's husband was found too. I was amused at you and your mom making jokes. That's some sisu. He had this thing, that he knew the swimming basics, but had a panic when he couldn't feel the ground under his feet. So he basically never swam, and didn't know how to regulate his breath when waves covered him. That is why he swallowed all the water. About the jokes, I remember one particular one. She basically said that we should pray, and I said something in the likes of, "We probably should have done that before we left." Your mom's a rock star, haha. If I had to choose a way to die, this is not too bad actually. The first moments of cold water suck, you hyperventilate, the cold stings like a mofo, but after a minute you get used to it, then things kinda gradually slow down until you pass out. I had to jump into a frozen lake fully clothed with skis on when I was in the military for a drill. Which memory do you think my brain threw up? I have a feeling you were right. My mother had a near-death experience with drowning, as a child. She remembers that at some point she just figured out that since she did not know how to swim and the surface was getting more and more out of reach, she was going to die, and she says she made peace with it. We basically messed up even trying to swim, if we just held still and bent our limbs to cover major arteries, we'd probably be better off. Here you can see the spot where it happened. We got maybe 40 to 50 meters towards that island on the left before realizing that it was hopeless. Was that heartbreaking? The closeness was just kinda peaceful. Basically, we both silently agreed that we were going to die, without actually saying it, or making any effort to say something worthwhile or deep. We just both knew that this was probably it. Oh, and we also didn't give up. We dodged waves, tried to hold onto each other, and kept some nonsense small talk going. We talked about it after this happened, and both agreed that this was what we were feeling at the time. I flew into powerlines. Frick. I'm late to the party. I was pilot in command of a small Cessna, taking my dad out for his first sightseeing ride on an October evening. He'd taken the backseat in one of my training sessions before, but this time was the first time the two of us were alone together and at liberty to go as we pleased. After a while, I noticed that the engine had lost 300 RPM. I pushed the throttle to max, no change. Turned on the carb heat, if I remember correctly, nope, still nothing. I began heading back to the airport, but as the power slowly diminished, I knew we wouldn't make it back by a long shot. Conclusion. I had to get that bird down somewhere. It was nighttime. Beneath me were patches of fields or forest, and I couldn't tell which was which in the evening darkness. I opted for the only well-lit place in the circumstances, the freeway. I made my emergency call, got a response, told my dad what I was about to do, and proceeded to fly the airplane. By the time I was on my so-called final approach, the engine was puttering along at a measly 1000 RPM despite a full open throttle. All I had to do was to follow a slight bend in the freeway to the left, just past a viaduct, and I'd have 3 open lanes of road on which to land and probably surprise a few drivers along the way. Huge black bars suddenly showed up in my field of vision, followed by bright white flashes of light. The aircraft had just struck high-voltage power lines. By the time I was done screaming, the aircraft had rolled down in a side ditch and slammed itself against a fence. Ambulances arrived within a minute, pulled my dad and I out, and raced us to the hospital. I awoke in a dimly lit hospital room, dimly lit because of the city-wide power failure I just caused, which I realized once all the other lights turned on late at night and the nurses cheered at getting power back. Somehow, I didn't break anything, though I had a sore and stiff body for a few weeks, and my back became prone to locking for the next several years. My father had a few broken bones, but was judged stable and set to recover. However, he suddenly and unexpectedly succumbed to his wounds a week later. I haven't piloted an aircraft since, and have no desire to. I can be a passenger in an airliner or a commercial small aircraft without a problem, but my days of flying are over. From what you described, it sounds like you noticed your engine trouble early. Too often pilots don't know anything is wrong until the stall horn is going off in the middle of a turn. With this in mind, if you decide to get current again, I would fly with you. What a lovely thing to say. This is crazy. I have 2 questions. 1. Did anyone on the ground, police, fire department, etc., assist in getting the freeway blocked for you to have room to land? And 2. Were you liable at all for any of the damage caused to the power lines or property? Your story is amazing, and caused me to think of these 2 questions that I've never thought of before in my life. So glad you made it out alive. I didn't notice any emergency vehicles when landing, and cars were happily rolling around without a care in the world. I suppose the ambulances were still getting to the scene by the time I landed. Also, I told them the town and the freeway number, but it's still a fairly big town all things considered. Only a grocery store sent me a letter seeking repairs for damages. I was told to forward this to the flight company's insurance. Nobody else came after me. I assume this must mean I didn't commit any gross error while handling the engine failure. A grocery store, of all things. Fellow pilot here, holy shit. The most horrifying thing is this could have happened to any one of us going through training. I'm so sorry for everything you had to go through. I thought I'd ask you as a pilot and not the story poster because they have obviously had such a loss, but shouldn't there be reflective lights or something on power lines? I swear they had visual markers on them for air traffic. No, not necessarily. They honestly should, though. It's a huge problem, especially for helicopters. I'm in a plane that specializes in flying pretty low to the ground, and it's pretty scary how those electrical lines, even the gigantic ones, sneak up on you. They blend in really well. I couldn't tell you why they haven't done it. Maybe it's too prevalent and costly to mark all of them. Maybe the wire itself can't tolerate some kind of coating. Really, the only ones that are more visible are the ones that have those weighted spheres on them to prevent them from blowing around. Even then, it's not easy. You did the right thing and did not panic. I believe you can do it, Redditor. Don't give up your wings. I hope one day you look at your fear from afar. Fly in a controlled environment with an instructor or a friend who knows how to fly. Then slowly move on to bigger challenges. And once you overcome them with confidence, you will see your fear loom in front of you. I say to you, pilot, look at it dead in the eyes and soar. Like a wave, let your fear wash over you, and once you let it pass through, all that remains is you and your wings. Soar, my friend, like the eagle you are destined to be. We believe in you. Godspeed. I survived a plane crash. Here's a question I can honestly answer. I survived an airplane crash. The story. My mother owned a few aircraft and hangar at our small town's airport. I spent a lot of time at the airport as I was growing up, spending summer washing airplanes, sweeping out hangars, etc. One warm summer afternoon in the mid-1980s, we planned to take a short flight in her Piper J3 Cub. This plane was built in the mid-1940s and had an aluminum skeleton covered in fabric and tandem seats, one in front, one in back. I sat in front due to the better view, and my mom, the pilot, sat in back. I remember the pre-flight and some taxiing to the runway, but nothing else. Now the rest of the story I received secondhand. Neither my mom nor I remember anything of the actual accident due to the massive head trauma we both received. But what I've heard from family and the ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene is that on takeoff, the most dangerous part of any flight, IMHO, we lost power. Engine cut out, not really sure why. So with a relatively slow airspeed and no thrust from the engine, we changed from being a beautiful flying machine to a brick rather quickly. Well, we dropped like a brick and proceeded to hit the ground in a rather quick manner. The ambulance drivers who arrived on the scene thought we were done for. Things did not look good for us. But after a helicopter ride to the nearest trauma center 100 miles away, we are still alive and breathing today. I spent about 5 weeks in the hospital, but only remember the last 2. To remind me what happened, I have nasty scars on my lower lip and chin and a dent on the side of head. One thing I find myself wondering is if I had the chance to relive the whole thing over again, would I want to remember? At this point in my life, I can say I would not. Such things are not worth remembering. And did we ever fly again? You bet. As soon as my mom was able to pass a flight physical, we were both up in the air again. Passing out saves you from most of the PTSD of trauma. Tiny miracles. I don't think it's passing out. I think your brain just wipes it. I was in an accident, no way near as serious as this guy's, wherein I broke my arm in 3 places, bent one of the bones, broke my hand, and was seriously concussed, and my brain wiped everything. All I remember is being halfway through talking with my friend. The next I was lying on a rock shelf. I agree with this. My house was hit by a tornado when I was in 5th grade. I'm the only one in my family who can't remember the exact moment the tornado hit. I remember my parents rushing me into the closet, and I remember going outside after to see all the damage. My parents and my brother remember the sound of glass breaking and things being thrown against the house. Specifically, the poles from my neighbor's trampoline were thrown into our roof. But I don't remember any of it. I was awake for the whole thing, so my only assumption is that my brain has blocked that out. I grew up next to a decorated Navy fighter pilot. I told him one time I heard that airliners were designed to be able to glide a certain distance if the engines failed. He laughed and said, "Yeah, glides just like a crowbar." Well, consider the 747-300, with a glide ratio of 17:1, can glide 17,000 feet horizontally for each 1,000 feet of altitude, cruising at approximately 40,000 feet. That's a horizontal path of up to 17 by 40,000 equals 680,000 feet. 680,000 feet, 5,280 feet per mile equals 128.8 miles. That's a pretty far way. Even at half of that, factoring for error, winds, or lower cruise altitude, it would be very easy to get to an airport with that range. And that's only if all engines fail. Most multi-engine planes can fly with one or more engines out. The problems come in if you have engine failures at low altitude. In 1982, a British Airways 747 flew through volcanic ash, lost all engines and glided for 13 minutes before landing in Jakarta. An awesome story, in part because they all lived. The pilot said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you are not in too much distress." Our Cessna crashed. I was in a plane crash in 2013. 3 friends and I had taken a Cessna to interior BC for the long weekend. One friend had their private pilot's license. The day we were heading home, it was quite hot, and the plane was, according to investigators, overloaded and overfueled for the heat, altitude. Once we reached 2,000 feet above takeoff, we began losing airspeed. The pilot panicked and did some steep turns in an attempt to gain some speed, but it scrubbed nearly all our altitude pretty much instantly. Now at a few hundred feet and descending rapidly, the pilot took aim at a farmer's field. They managed to level out at around tree height, but we were quickly running out of field. Maybe 100 or so meters before the end of the field, they dropped the plane to the ground. The nose dug in and we flipped end for end. I ended up walking away essentially unscathed, minor bruising from the seatbelt and some small scratches. The pilot had a pretty good cut and bashed their knee up on the dashboard. The front passenger, my GF, took pretty much the brunt of it all. Her seat ripped off the floor, smashing her against the roof. It shredded the ligaments in one side of her neck, compressed her spine, and concussed her badly. The ligaments were bad, and are still causing issues now 5 years later. But the post-concussion issues were far worse. Watching someone you love lose the ability to read, remember what they had for breakfast or whether or not they had breakfast, maintain any semblance of emotional stability, or even do something like play a board game to pass the time. Learning and remembering rules was too stressful, was the worst thing I have ever experienced. It took a solid 2 years before things started returning to what I could call normal. I'm sure I'll come back and add to this post, but I've got to get back to work. TLDR, here's a pic of the plane. My brother died in a float plane accident in northern Quebec under very similar circumstances, hot day, heavy plane. The pilot and my brother both died, instantly, I believe, hope. I was shocked to learn how little teeth the airline inspection, certification process has. I'm glad that you guys survived, and I'm so sorry that your girlfriend has suffered so. Post-concussion syndrome is the utmost bitch. I got concussed in March and was off work for 4 months. Still have headaches, mood swings. My appetite is still weird. Sometimes I will eat 1 meal in a day. Others I will eat 5. My eye-hand coordination is still shocking enough that I want drive. My memories of the first few months are a haze and I still forget random shit, and I totally get the reading thing. I have hundreds of books and haven't read a thing because I can't concentrate enough to understand it. It's freaking odd. Nowhere near as bad as hers, but I unfortunately know some of what she went through. My boat sank on the Mekong River. I was on a boat that sank on the Mekong River in Southeast Asia. It was a 2-day trip with an overnight stop, as it is too dangerous to be on the river after dark. We stayed in a bar and got extremely drunk as there was a serious tropical storm that knocked the power out in this tiny village on the banks of the river. The following morning we set off on the final leg of the journey really early the next day. Everyone was feeling pretty terrible after drinking way too much, so we're trying to catch a few hours nap on the boat. Around an hour or 2 into the journey, the boat rolled quite heavily to one side and some cups and glasses slid off the tables and fell onto the floor, startling most people awake. We picked the stuff up off the floor and went back to sleep. I'm not really sure how much later, but the same thing happened again, but even more violently. The boat rolled so heavily I slid from one side to the other and smashed into a table on the now lower side of the boat. At this point I noticed that water had started to come over the side and was getting deeper. Everyone was looking around at each other, looking pretty terrified, not knowing what to do. The water level was now at probably waist height. I told my GF to get out of the boat and swim for the banks of the river. I had to help her climb out the high side of the boat and onto the roof, as the lower side was now pretty much fully submerged. At this point I realized I was stuck between the table I had smashed into and a bench that had fallen on top of my leg. With the water now getting towards shoulder height and the boat sinking pretty rapidly, I took a final breath and went down with the boat. It's hard to say how long, but it probably sank in around a minute, 2 if you were being generous. Luckily, as the boat fully sank, the benches and tables started to float and move away from each other, and I got free without too much trouble. I opened my eyes and all I could see was brown dirty water with some sunlight in the distance. I swam towards it, being careful not to knock my head on anything and knock myself out, trying to swim horizontal until I was sure I was clear from the boat before I could try for the surface. I managed to pop up not too far away from the river bank. I looked around and saw a few of the other passengers being swirled around in the rough current, trying to grab anything that was floating to save themselves, calling out for help. I'm a pretty terrible swimmer, so realized trying to help anyone else would probably just end in them dragging me down with them, so struggled and eventually made it to the bank. I made it but didn't have the energy to pull myself out of the water. I half got onto some rocks and waited to catch my breath. Some other passengers that made it out of the water ran over to tell me my GF was safe further downstream. The guy driving the boat had jumped in and pulled her out because she was struggling. To give some background detail, this boat was being run by a young family that lived on board. As it customary in large parts of SE Asia, it is considered rude to wear your shoes inside someone's house. As a consequence, we had to remove our shoes when boarding the boat. We were now trying to traverse the rocky banks of the river with no shoes, trying to find other passengers. Getting back to the main story, the captain of the boat at this stage was screaming at the river, not knowing if his wife and 2 children made it off the boat before it sank. We came across them later on. His wife had somehow managed to make it off with her baby slung over her back and her young son. After a while, we had managed to flag down another passing boat. Initially they didn't stop, but I think they must have started to see random bits of floating debris from the boat and realized what had happened and came back for us. Further down the river we found more passengers that had been rescued by some local fishermen. We tried to account for everyone and quickly worked out that everyone was present apart from one girl. No one had seen her during the scramble to get off the boat. We boarded the boat that we managed to flag down and left for the next nearest large town where we would be able to get in contact with our country's embassies. There was zero phone signal around here and all our phones were either in the river or completely soaked, which was over 6 hours away. The local fishermen promised us they would search for the missing passenger. Having made it to the next town after a pretty fricking long day, by this point we were greeted by the local police who were in plain clothes as it was Songkran and everyone was celebrating by having a huge 3-day water fight. They took some details and told us to come to the station in a few days. We ended up having to sit around for days sorting out loads of stuff as our passports were lost and all the local places that could do anything were closed. Once we got enough documents to allow us to move on and fly to the capital, we had to go to our consulate to sort out new travel documents and assist in the matter about the missing passenger with her friends that had made it off the boat. She was from the same country. After a few days, the consulate informed us a body had been found, and unfortunately it was the missing passenger, which was pretty devastating experience to take along with the additional stress everyone was currently going through. I feel like I'm rambling on now, but after a few weeks we luckily managed to get new passports without flying home, which we were informed is the standard procedure for my country's passport office. Going home to get a full passport wasn't really an option as we were around 5 weeks into a 7-month trip. Was a pretty fun 6 months after that, although did end up in some other pretty dangerous situations. We were also on 2 buses that crashed, and a friend of mine that came and met us for a month was involved in a pretty nasty motorbike accident. Apologies for the piss poor comprehension. I've never taken the time to write this experience down before and I'm not the best writer as it is. TLDR. Got on a boat, it sank, it wasn't much fun. Was this on the Mekong River from northeast of Chiang Rai down to Luang Prabang? Stopping at Pak Bang? I did that boat journey in 2013. Always thought it would be a horrible place to suffer a tragedy like that. So glad you're okay. I did that trip too, back in 2002. I have great memories of it, though the boat was uncomfortable as frick. At the time it seemed a lot safer than the boat trip I'd made in stormy seas off the Cambodian coast. I'm taking this ride in 2 days. Definitely shouldn't have read this. Take the slow boat. Our ride was uncomfortable but fine, smiley face. We briefly considered the fast boat, but it looked scary as hell. I remember some passengers were wearing motorcycle helmets. Yikes. Take a jacket or blanket. Wind is cold on the river for 2 days and you can't get to your luggage during the boat ride. I froze in a t-shirt and shorts. Jesus, I've done that 2-day trip up the Mekong, but our boat had about 30 to 40 people on it. At one point the captain was fighting some rapids and rocks and it almost capsized because too many people were on one side standing up, making it unbalanced. I had my arm resting on the side of the boat and the water touched it, was about 1 inch from coming over the side. The driver was screaming at the passengers in local Laos language to sit back down, but those morons were too drunk, high to realize what almost happened. Getting to Luang Prabang was a relief. Holy shit dude, I'm glad y'all made it out. TBH, I'm not a strong swimmer at all, and a life jacket would have been my best friend. Hope all is well. A life jacket would have been great. There didn't appear to be any on the boat though. There is a totally different attitude towards safety in SE Asia. A few months later, we were on a ferry in Indonesia crossing from Java to Bali. The lift jackets were in a cupboard that had been secured with a padlock, and someone had set up a shop in front of it selling snacks and drinks. Hey, crazy story. I live in SE Asia now, and I'm wondering if you know any other details about the boat or water conditions that may have caused this. One of those big wooden boats that are kind of flat, with a cabin on one end sort of things? And I know the Mekong gets pretty choppy, but was there any special weather conditions or anything that caused it to go down? I think the boat you are describing is the same. There didn't seem to be any special weather conditions or anything out of the ordinary. It is hard to tell as I was half asleep at the time, but it felt to me like it may have been an inexperienced captain coupled with hitting some rough water, but it would have been anything, hitting a rock, problem with the boat, who knows. The government told us the section of river the boat sank in was too rough to send divers down to inspect the wreckage. The Mekong is dammed in China before making its way through Laos. The locals were up in arms when it happened because during the dry season it can cause the water level of the river to be very low. Much more than before the river was dammed. Looks like the water levels were low in an otherwise fine section of river. That day had rocks just below the surface. Emergency landing with Cessna. My plane landed in a field and flipped. Flying in a single-engine Cessna 210, my family was on the final leg of a 2-week camping trip. My dad, piloting, had started the descent down when at 3,000 feet, our engine started rattling uncontrollably. 10-year-old me remembers seeing the oil temperature gauge in the red, but not understanding the significance. As the rattling got worse, my dad shut the engine off and radioed Mayday to the tower. That's when I started to pray. We were only 5-ish miles from our final destination, but we had to make an emergency landing in a field. I remember staring out the window at the ground thinking about my cat, and my mom leaning back from the co-pilot seat to tell my brother and I to pull our legs up for the crash position. My dad exchanged a few other words with the controller and then shut the rest of the plane down. We hit the ground a little fast at 80 knots, normal is 65 to 70 knots. Our front gear struck an irrigation pipe running across the field, which caused it to shear off. Without a front gear, our nose hit the field and we went belly side up. When I came to, everything was eerily dark, and I was hanging upside down. My dad basically ripped the doors off the back of the plane to get my brother and I out. My family was shaken up, but okay. The farmer appeared minutes later, absolutely astonished. Then, 5 news helicopters starting circling. Traffic was backed up for miles around the field as people strained to get a look. Then the paramedics arrived. My mom likes to joke they were a bit disappointed to find victims of a plane crash to be standing around chatting. The worst injury of the lot was my cut lip, which I cut with my own teeth in the jolt of the crash. And my parents got some bruising from seatbelts a few days later. The farmer's wife gave my brother and I Cheez-Its and honey sticks, and I can't eat them to this day. And the first thing I did when I got back home was hug my cat, as a 10-year-old does. As far as my individual story goes, I got my pilot's license 3 years ago at the age of 18. I'm now in school to become an aerospace engineer, where I hope to one day design planes that save people like this one saved my life. It failed in the most elegant of ways, and my dad's quick thinking and training was able to see us to the ground alive. And for those wondering what happened to the plane, an unidentified object clogged the oil filter in the engine, leading to a piston overheating, snapping, and punching a hole in the side of the engine. And the first thing I did when I got back home was hug my cat, as a 10-year-old does. Exactly what I did when I got home after being hit by a car. He made a beeline for me and stuck to me like glue for the next week. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew. Pets. They know. I work on helicopters in the military, and they harp on FOD, foreign object debris or damage, till your ears fall off, but rightfully so. One tiny bolt left in the wrong place can take an entire bird down. It really sends the message home hearing about this firsthand. Glad you and your family ended up okay. Aw, so glad you survived, smiley face. It was sweet hearing you think about you cat. I would have done the same thing. Do you have the same kitty now by any chance? Yes. Since I'm away from home for school, I don't get to see her very much, but she's hanging in there, smiley face. Anytime I see, Hear about a small plane crash, it's a Cessna. Like almost always it's a Cessna. Bloody hell, I'm going to stay away from those planes. Cessna planes are the most common small plane, so that's why you probably hear about a lot of crashes with them. A big problem we have with airplanes today is that the process for getting an airplane approved to sell is so expensive that most small plane manufacturers just use the same designs approved decades ago. Profit margins are very slim on small aircraft, which are less safe. It's not that Cessnas are problematic airplanes. They're not. They're very forgiving to fly and as reliable as any. It's just that there are so many of them, by far the most of any type of plane. Virtually every single pilot has flown a Cessna 172 at one point or another, and most train on them. It failed in the most elegant of ways. Would you mind expanding on this a little? When we hit the ground, we were headed towards an embankment, a freeway, a concrete wall, and power lines, i.e., Megadeth. Because our front wheel got stuck in the mud and hit an irrigation pipe, we flipped and came to rest before we ran off the field. That's a pretty good stroke of luck, but I also think the design of the airplane enabled it to come to a rest so quickly. The airplane's structure was designed to withstand that upside-down impact. Even though it was not usable after the fact, the aluminum frame crumpled in a way that successfully absorbed the impact, while still allowing us to escape through doors that could be opened. And to think this thing was designed to operate for 40 years in flight but still have enough robustness about its design to protect its occupants when it finally crashed. Not that this is very engineering-wise or scientific by any means. Mostly the musings of an awestruck passenger. Gators almost killed us. When I was 19, my buddy and I went fishing in a pretty big lake up in Gainesville, Florida. I was sitting at the very front with the cooler to try to balance out the weight, and while we were crossing the middle of the lake in our canoe, we had a paddle strapped to the side and it caught the water while we were going about 20 miles per hour. It threw us probably 7 to 10 feet and immediately started sinking. About 5 minutes before that happened, we decided to put both of our phones in a waterproof box, which ultimately saved us. There was no one else out that day given it was a little chilly outside. So after we were in the water, the boat started sinking fast, but my friend and I stayed calm and started brainstorming on what we should do. First thing I did was swim down to the boat and by feel had to find the phones. Once that happened, we called the police, but their response time was awful. We were treading in water that was cold enough to give us hypothermia, with the box that had our phones in it over our heads for about 50 minuets until the dispatch lady said they were commandeering someone else's boat because theirs wasn't starting. Once we got out, the officers told us that they were expecting to find us dead, either from getting stuck on the mushy bottom and drowning or by some of the big gators, but luckily we didn't encounter any of them. After the ambulance took our temperature and we came back fine, they proceeded to make sure we were okay, then let us get on with our day. Life and death situations are no joke and they can happen at any time. Make sure you are prepared mentally and physically. Your life or your friends may depend on you and how you've trained. Swim down to the boat and by feel had to find the phones. Big gators, oh frick that. I love how they took forever to get there and then said they had expected to find you dead. Why did you not have life jackets? As a native Floridian and longtime boater, you should have at least had them on board that boat. I'm not trying to make you feel bad or humiliate you, but it was immensely dumb and also illegal not to have life jackets on board. We were aware it was dumb. Forgot them in the truck. We were too hyped up about fishing. I had a near drowning and handled it much poorer. When my wife and I were newly dating, we got a couple of shitty plastic kayaks and went out on a glacier lake near where we live. Being the youngish child-free people we were, of course, there was a cooler of jungle juice and probably some self-medicating before we went out. Luckily, we decided to turn around before we made it to the glacier, because just after I flipped my kayak into the freezing water. I managed to get the kayak flipped back and mostly empty of water, but by then I was losing feeling in my hands and I couldn't get myself back in. I had a flotation vest on, but I knew if I didn't get a good grip I was dead, so I grabbed a rope on my wife's kayak hard and told her to tow me back to shore. Booze and drugs on top of hypothermia doesn't do much for intelligent thinking, so instead of letting go of my kayak I held onto it, as well as the paddle and cooler. I knew if I let go I wouldn't be able to close my hand again, so my poor wife was paddling hard, dragging me, my water-filled kayak in the cooler. I knew I was in a pretty shitty position. My wife has asthma, and if she had an attack, started to panic, or was just too slow getting me back to shore, I was going to die. So I kept telling her I was fine and that everything was going to be okay, even though I had lost feeling in my extremities. My lips and fingers were blue. My jaw was locking up and I was starting to have trouble breathing. We made it back and I could barely get out of the water. I told her to take her clothes off so I could snuggle up to her for body heat, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She probably thought I was just trying to get her half naked. Thank goodness for survival training when I was young. I couldn't think clearly, but it's pretty ingrained. Plus I've had hypothermia a couple times before, so I knew the drill. She jokes that she saved my life, but the truth is she absolutely saved my life. She was a tiny little 115 pounds thing and her little arms never stopped paddling, dragging several hundred pounds of stupidity halfway across a glacier lake. Almost lynched by villagers. Back in 2008, I was in a hiking, sightseeing tour with a well-known rugged travel outfitter. The tour started in New Delhi, India and ended in Kathmandu, Nepal. Halfway through the tour, we meander our way to Varanasi when there were rumors of strikes in Nepal, mainly Lumbini and the Chitwan National Park area. So instead of taking a bus to the border to get to the park in Nepal, we took a plane. Crisis averted, right? Landed in Kathmandu, and of course the baggage handlers decided to strike. Had to wait about 5 hours to get our bags. Faced with rolling eyes, we stayed about a day at Kathmandu and about the strike ended. We ended up proceeding with our trip to the Chitwan National Park and staying at a homestay for a few days. After a few days of getting our fill of elephant riding, hippo watching and tiger tracking, there were rumors going around in the village about a huge strike next day with travel on the roads potentially barred with the threat of death. We all decided to head out extremely early so we would not be stuck in Chitwan for potentially days. So around 3 a.m., me and 11 other members of the group and our guide and driver head out into the dark and onto Kathmandu. It was quiet for about the 15 to 20 minutes of driving in the dark, lots of meandering turns around small villages and lakes. However, that was stopped short. We saw a small minibus torched, fires burning wildly, and soon we were stopped by these masked villagers holding sticks. One of them came to the driver's side and pulled the driver out, proceeded to repeatedly smack him on his face over and over. Another masked man tried to open our passenger door. Luckily it could only be opened by one side, and luckily it was held tightly closed by a burly Australian member of our group. While this was going on, another masked man broke our back window. This resulted in a few of us crying in fear. Me, my cousin and a few other guys were thinking of breaking out of the car and tackling these masked men with skirts, longies. We figured the combined arms of a few Americans, Aussies and a German can take them down, right? No sooner than we thought of that plan, motorcycles started roaring in close by, carrying Molotov cocktails. Shit. Our guide and the driver started pleading with them, saying we are tourists, there are women in here and that we will go back in peace, just let us go. They eventually let us go, told us to turn around and don't come out until the strike is over. To this day, every time I hear glass break, I cringe and remember these events clearly. I am sorry for this life-threatening experience you had to go through in Nepal. Some people use violence for political gain, but overall, Nepalese people are nice and welcoming. The country is healing from a decade-long war and a recent earthquake. We are sorry, and you will have an amazing experience if you give us a chance again. Hey man, don't worry. I love Nepal and I want to go back again. I've also traveled to base camp with no worries or issues. Everyone was very accommodating and nice. My parents are Bangladeshi and I remember also hardals aka strikes are just as common and can be violent. On a side note, being Bengali also got me discounts with the shopkeepers because a lot of them apparently went to university in Dhaka. I blew up my own house. Probably a bit too late to the party, but when I was 10 my house kinda blew up. When I was 10 years old, less than 10 days before Christmas time, there was a gas leak at my house. We had no idea it was leaking, but it had been building up behind our wall near the gas fireplace for a while. In the morning I was getting ready to go to school. My mom was almost ready to go to work, and I was tying my shoes to head out the door. My mom comes out of the bathroom and is putting on her earrings, grabbing her cell phone, etc., and is heading toward the door. She tells me to unplug the Christmas tree lights. We love decorating. When I did, the spark from unplugging them ignited the box around the socket, and then the pocket of gas behind the wall. It all blew up. The fireplace was pushed out of the wall in one whole piece. The wall was destroyed. The mantle over the fireplace flew clear across the room. The nutcrackers we left on the fireplace flew across the room and 2 got embedded in the wall. The Christmas tree, luckily a fake plastic one, was knocked over. The side facing the wall was curled, melted, and burned. Almost every ornament made of breakable stuff was shattered. Rather from the boom, or the fall, hard to tell. The shock wave traveled through the house, down the hallway into my mom's room and blew out the sliding glass door, and blew it into the pool in pieces the size of pennies or smaller. All throughout the house were stress cracks in the sheetrock, cracks in windows, various things. We were lucky. I got minor burns on my face. I was just off to the side of said blown-up wall. My mom was sitting on a chair near the door, far away from it all. Had she sat on the couch to put on her shoes, as she does sometimes, she may have been severely injured or worse. There was no real fire. It was more of a blast of really hot air, really fast. The fireman chief called it a flash fire. There was no fire because there was nothing close enough to the hottest part that could ignite. Good thing we got a fake reusable tree that year to save money. If we had not, it definitely would have blown up. I survived a mass shooting. Survived the Isla Vista shooting of 2014. I still get jumpy when I hear fireworks or other loud noises. My immediate response is almost always to scramble under the nearest table. PTSD is a bitch. I live in IV now. The presence of that shooting can still be felt. Glad you are still here. Oh shit, I lived there in 2010. I didn't even know about the 2014 shooting. Sad face. This world has so much messed up stuff happen that it's hard not to have your mind entertain the worst possibilities even without PTSD. I was leaving the evening class 1 teach tonight and heard a series of bangs nearby, either on the campus or in a nearby neighborhood. I hastened my walk to the car thinking that some real shit was going down. Apparently Halloween is an appropriate time for fireworks now because as my vantage changed I could see them not too far away beyond some trees. It's sad that in the world today it's easier to imagine that someone is doing something horrible than to imagine innocent fun. My friend ended up giving CPR to the girls, Katie and Veronica, I believe. I think about him every time I hear fireworks that sound like gunshots. I can't imagine being in that position trying desperately to save these girls that didn't make it. At least your reaction wasn't to get more guns to keep yourself safe. Yeah, I'm the biggest Second Amendment supporter ever and I roll my eyes at people whose first reaction is to run out and buy more guns like a spendaholic woman at a shoe sale. Even soldiers are only trained to use one gun at a time for a reason. And 2 guns is all you'll ever need anyway, 1 long gun and 1 handgun. 3 if you hunt something that you can't use a rifle and a shotgun for. Pro tip. In a survival situation, having 1 gun and being a dead shot with it is far better than having 6 guns and 5 people who can barely hit the broad side of a barn. Edit. Insight from a Navy pal. The 5 people may be so much more of a liability than an asset in said scenario. It might actually be better if they all hid and kept out of the way. Versus trying to fight and shooting themselves, each other, an innocent person half a mile away when they miss or anything else besides their intended target. But Hollywood told me that a man without any training can hit a target 1 centimeter wide from half a mile away. Edit. Since apparently the intense sarcasm was missed. Nice. You have made it to the end already. Thank you for watching. If you aren't already subscribed, please do so, as there will be more videos like this in the near future.